Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast. Today, it is, what is it today? It's May 26th, and we have a few different topics we're going to talk about. We're also going to get to your questions. We have two pretty meaty questions we're going to dig into in the second half of the podcast. But to start with, we have two kind of big issues that we want to talk about. One is what is happening on Capitol Hill. We have, I have mentioned a number of times that we are in this weird sort of era of opacity where most of the most of the real negotiations, most of the real discussions about what is possible and what may happen, those are happening really out of public eye because they're happening largely within the Democratic caucus. I mean, entirely within the Democratic caucus in the Senate and also between the Democratic caucus in the Senate and the White House. And at the same time, you have what is, I think, largely a for show semi public negotiation happening between the two parties in the Senate. And what are we, what is actually up for negotiation? Well, basically two things. One is this January 6th commission, which seems at this point pretty unlikely to come to fruition as a as a bipartisan commission, as something that passes in Congress and then is created. I think if that fails, there is the possibility that uh, the White House will just create one, without involving Congress, which they can do. But in any case, that is one thing that is going on, and at least at the moment, unless Kate has some update I haven't heard about yet, there are a grand total of two Republicans who are in support of a commission, and that is not surprisingly Mitt Romney and Senator Murkowski from Alaska, and obviously that leaves you eight short. And it's kind of we could have expected those two. Those aren't a surprise, and there's maybe a couple others who wouldn't be a huge surprise, sort of like a Susan Collins or something like that. You can almost always get in the current configuration. You can almost always get three or four people, three or four Republican senators, but you can't get the other half a dozen. And that seems to be where we are right now. Now, the other thing, which to me is a much bigger deal, is this question of an infrastructure plan. And under infrastructure, we've talked about the White House has kind of broken this up into two separate things, sort of hard infrastructure, which is the American Jobs Plan, and then soft infrastructure, caring economy and stuff like that, which is the American Family Plan. Now, the idea kind of was that this was going to go, that you're going to do another reconciliation package, which, remember, is this special path that where a bill cannot be filibustered when it's complicated, but basically when it has budgetary impact. And that you're going to do this with 50 Democrats, and that's it. You do a little talk about if there's a bipartisan possibility of a bipartisan agreement, but it seems like the two parties are off by like potentially trillions of dollars, so it's not really clear that is going anywhere. So we're going to talk about that. And my big, there's another kind of gang or Manchin with a couple Republicans, and they're talking about using some leftover COVID money and gas taxes and this, that, and the other, and a lower price tag. And my question or my concern here is, all Democrats remain traumatized by what happened during the Obama administration, where you get Republicans kind of notionally negotiating, but in practice, kind of winding down the clock, um, and just frittering time. And then suddenly you're into a new election year, nothing's going to happen, and you're just kind of you've been bamboozled. And I have not been, I have not kept up on every movement of these negotiations, but I have been getting kind of a little nervous because it feels like that's happening. When are we when is a decision going to be made here? And are we kind of ticking down through less smaller bills that Republicans are never going to support anyway? So we're going to talk about that. We'll try to figure out what's happening there, and separate from, I mean, I think we know what's happening there. We know that um, we know the Republicans aren't going to agree to anything. So the real question is there any thinking? Is there any timeline? Is there any teeth to when Democrats slash the White House just says, okay, enough. We're we're going to move ahead. We're going to try to do this with 50 votes. So we're going to talk about that. And then the other thing we're going to talk about is something that I've been writing about a lot on in the editor's blog in the last few days, which is these seemingly small stories around the country where organized violence or threats of violence or paramilitary groups, quote unquote militias, threatening public officials, that these things are becoming wound up with conventional politics. Now, and what I mean by that is this: there's we obviously there's white supremacist terrorism, violence, blah 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 blah. I mean, back more than 25 years ago, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. So that is not new. It's relatively rare, but it's not new. But there's something very different between that and cases where conventional politics starts to get wound up with threats of violence. So, like, there's this case out in Shasta County, California, which is a rural county up in the north of the state, very conservative. And there is a recall effort there that is kind of tied to COVID stuff. We've seen this a lot of places. This is not something unknown, and it's not. That's just conventional politics at a certain level, right? That's the some states have recalls for county officials or whatever, and the public is dissatisfied with how they're governing. They have a recall. That's politics. In this case, though, you've got this militia group in the background kind of threatening public officials, and they are kind of wound up. This militia, quote unquote, militia group is kind of associated with the recall, and there's been a lot of threats to current public officials and people who are opposing the recall. You have these, like, recall opponents, but they won't publicize their names because they're afraid of getting targeted by the militia. So you have this thing of, again, um, organized violence, threats of violence seeping its way into conventional politics, which is obviously a very dangerous thing for civic life. And I have been looking for examples in different parts of the country of this, and there are a lot of them. There are a lot of them, and they are mostly just under the radar because they're tied to county governments or county parties, or often it's kind of vague. Someone felt threatened and they resigned. There's most of these have not risen up into the national political news conversation. But anyway, we're going to talk about those things. Before we do, I want to remind you that it is summer. I guess this weekend is the official lead off of summer, and that means frisbee, barbecues, picnics, some variation of those things, and iced coffee. So remember to ring in the summer with Grady's New Orleans style cold brew kit. You just add water to the reusable store and pour pouch and brew it overnight for velvety smooth coffee you can drink iced or hot. You can bring it to the park, you can take it camping, you can add a little vodka if you're feeling particularly adventurous. Hey, it's summer. You're allowed to do that kind of stuff. So if you're ready to give it a swirl, get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. So, Kate, my co-host, Kate, what is up? What do we got on our agenda?
Well, we've got a lot, but I guess we'll start with infrastructure in the Senate, which, as you say, things are not looking particularly promising. There was kind of an unofficial deadline that Memorial Day would be the backstop on when Democrats are going to determine how these negotiations with Republicans are going. And, implicit in that, kind of that would be the cutoff on when do we go it alone? When do we decide that these are not, producing anything in an attempt, like you say, to not fall into those traps of the Obama years, where you spend months trying to negotiate with Republicans on the ACA, you end up with a smaller, weaker bill. They don't support it anyway. Um, but, that strategy is only useful insofar as, Joe Manchin goes along with it, essentially. And he has been indicating in recent days that he does not really respect that unofficial deadline, that he wants to keep negotiating. Like you say, he's kind of gathering a backup group of bipartisan negotiators in case this initial group that's spearheaded by Shelley Moore Capito falls through. Capito's group is unveiling another counteroffer tomorrow, which is expected to be around $1 trillion, though it's not totally clear how much of that is new spending, how much of that is an attempt to kind of repurpose spending from other places. Um, and, on the big stuff, they're just still far apart on the how are we going to pay for it, Republicans refusing to raise taxes. And, if we're looking for one indicator of how this kind of new counter proposal will play, Mitt Romney was pretty dismissive of it. So if you don't have Romney on board, who do you have?
Now, when we say 1 trillion, there's is that 1 trillion as a counter for the spending for both of these
Just for
plans,
the jobs
or is
plan.
that's for the infrastructure?
Yep.
Okay, and Biden, he had a proposal, and tell me what the number was there. But the proposal, I mean, at least, I mean, the devil's in the details, as you
Hmm.
said. Like, kind of, is it new? Is it new money? Is it just kind of money you're sort of calling infrastructure spending that is
Right.
already in the works and stuff like that? But Biden's proposal wasn't too much off $1 trillion, was
Right.
it?
His opening proposal for the jobs piece of the plan was 2.3 trillion, which then he lowered to 1.7 during these
Right.
negotiations. And then
Okay.
Republicans have been around 500 billion or so, and they've pretty much just, relatively nickeled and dimed up from there.
But there's a new proposal that from them that they're going to do that is around 1 trillion. Or at least, again, that's the bumper sticker number.
Exactly. And the
Okay.
reporting is that they came up with that number because Biden said that's a number he could get behind. That's a plan he could accept. But again, the sticking point is this just going to be COVID relief money that they say states and counties haven't spent yet? That's been kind of a recurring Republican chorus, saying, why are we spending this new money when there are these kind of alleged pots of money all over the place that are going untouched. And that doesn't really get into the complications around that money, which is, some have parameters around how they can be spent. Some you have places that don't want to spend it all at once because they're not sure, when they'll get more money and all that kind of stuff.
So what they're in a lot of cases, what they're saying is this unused money is to the states and localities. They're saying it's not unused yet, but we're not, like, we don't want to be rushed. We want to sort of pace it out.
Right.
So in that sense, it's money that has maybe not been spent yet, but it's not like it's kind of no one wants
Right,
it,
exactly.
or they don't, or kind of it's just laying around waiting to be used for something else. What is the tax side of this? So basically, the Democrats want to basically undo at least large parts of the 2017 tax cut, the Trump tax cut. They also want to uh, change long-term capital gains to bring it in line with the tax rates for salary income. So there you have not only like that's where you're going to get the money, but obviously Democrats have a broader agenda of just changing the tax code for broader issues of inequality, blah 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 blah. And then what Republicans are saying, gas tax
Right.
and something
Right.
kind
So
of.
the kind of cheat sheet easy way to think about it is for the jobs pillar of Biden's infrastructure plan, he wants to pay for that through raising corporate taxes. And then for the kind of human infrastructure piece, he wants to pay for that by raising taxes on the wealthy, broadly. Those are the two buckets. So to pay for this part, he wants to raise the corporate tax rate.
But wealthy
Right,
individuals, corporate
individuals
versus
versus
individual
corporations.
rates. Right,
Exactly.
right.
So he wants to raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. Republicans have, rejected that out of hand. They say it'll make America non-competitive. So they've kind of suggested a gas tax vaguely, an electric vehicle tax vaguely. It so far before this proposal, which is expected that they'll kind of push for the spending COVID relief money, their pay fors have been kind of not really locked down, not very specific, at least in what's, come out publicly. And then, there's also the piece that this internal messaging document that kind of circulated maybe about a month ago, that gave Republicans reasons to oppose Biden's infrastructure proposal. They had in there some like negative polling, people's reaction to being individually taxed to pay for it. So that would kind of fall into the bucket of the gas tax or any other kind of tax they're trying to impose on people who use the infrastructure. So it almost does seem like Biden would be being set up to fail if he said, okay, yeah, we're going to do that. Because it seems like they're pretty prepared to pivot and use that against him.
Right, to kind of demand a gas tax and then vote and then run
And then
against a
say, how
gas
dare you
tax
tax
because
our
it's.
rural constituents kind of thing.
Well, and also, I mean, a gas tax is, I mean, there's various ways you can structure it, but a gas tax is a consumption tax that is fairly regressive, right? I mean, Bill Gates doesn't spend, billions of dollars on gas for his car, right?
Right.
We all spend relatively similar amounts for gasoline and stuff like that. So that's something we know about. Now, what is the electric car thing? Because at least, I mean, the broadly speaking, the federal government is trying to get into the business of subsidizing
Right.
or favoring green technologies, and obviously, uh, car automotive fleets that don't rely on fossil fuels is a central part of that. So if you're taxing electric vehicles, that seems like a total non-starter, let alone for in climate terms. Is that
Exactly.
am I understanding that
Yeah.
right?
I mean, and that's kind of why from the earliest Republican proposals, it seemed like, okay, here's a way for them to say they're trying to negotiate in a bipartisan way, while even the earliest draft of this has proposals that, of course, Democrats are going to reject out of hand because it's, philosophically poison to them. So yeah,
Right,
I mean that's where
right,
we are
right.
now. And then you have the the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party being like, okay, we tried. We spent weeks on negotiations. Biden was involved. This is clearly we're not substantially any further than we were when Capito first unveiled the Republican kind of draft plan. Um, so you have Bernie Sanders saying, "I'm ready to go ahead with reconciliation. Like, let's move on." And then a reporter asked Manchin about this yesterday, I think, and he said, if you think you got it, then go for it, kind of daring him almost to go because he knows reconciliation is not going to go anywhere without Manchin's vote,
without him.
who has
So he's basically just saying kind of like, fuck you,
yeah,
I'm not for it. So do your best,
exactly, who
basically.
has decided
Right,
that he
right,
wants to
right.
keep negotiating. So, that's and it's one of those things where I think a natural reaction is to kind of be like, well, now the Biden administration is, falling into the same pitfalls as the Obama administration, taking Republicans at face value, blah, blah, blah. But, that's not really the situation. They have
Right,
almost
it's
no
Manchin.
choice. They have to show
Yeah,
Manchin,
yeah.
like, we're trying. And even if they didn't show him, what are they going to do? Go be like, never mind, we're going through reconciliation. And I mean, they could call his bluff, but if he ends up following
Yeah, I mean
through, that's pretty
yeah, I
big.
mean that's really the question, and that is why, I mean, again, it goes back to what we've talked about, the opacity.
Yeah.
Like, those are the kind of things that are only going to get that are only going to get figured out probably in conversations directly between Manchin and Biden. That's not something that gets left to deputies or intermediaries or something like that. So, you know, it's possible. What's so hard for those of us who are on the outside is that, maybe Manchin has told Biden, like, look, I need to go at this a little bit longer. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna let this go through the summer and kind of like nothing ever happens. I'm not gonna let that happen. I'll be there for reconciliation, but you need to let me work at this. Well, that's one thing, if that conversation has happened, but we don't know if that conversation has happened.
Well, and the goofiest thing about me is, or to me, is like, you think West Virginia voters are going to decide whether or not Manchin is a bipartisan person based on the exact number of weeks the infrastructure negotiations go on? Like, that's ridiculous. Come on.
Well, that's, uh, yeah. I mean, we don't know. The one thing I will say is that you cannot. There's no gainsaying Joe Manchin's ability to understand and navigate the politics of his home state. And we can say that just by the fact that he's managed to continue to be reelected in what is, by many measures, perhaps the most Republican state in the country. And when I say most Republican state, I'm mainly talking about the presidential margins in the last 2, 3, maybe 4 elections. I mean, I haven't looked closely, but I think it may actually be bigger margins than like Idaho and stuff. I mean, it's nuts, right? I mean, like Trump, what was it? Trump won by like 40% or something
Yeah.
like that in 2016. So you know, he knows what he's doing in that state, and so it's a tough one. Now, remind me this. So I thought the idea was, kind of time limit, um, Memorial Day for kind of, are we negotiating, and then Labor Day for when, like, a signed bill. Is that was am I remembering that, or was that second part
I thought
a little
it
more
was the
vague?
4th of July
Okay.
that Pelosi
Well, Fourth
said
of
she
July
wants
is
it through the House.
right. Okay,
Yeah,
so
that's
conceivably
right.
that could be, those two things can be brought together. It takes a while to get something through the Senate, even if you're doing it through reconciliation. But those are all. I mean, if uh, if that is her plan, that's pretty soon.
Mhm.
That's like 6 weeks from now. That's not long. So yeah, huh. Well, I would assume that, in pretty short order, maybe over the next, 3 or 4 weeks, you're going to have a decision point with Manchin, or else those other things just don't, you know, uh, the schedules don't work.
Mhm.
And clearly, what they're trying to what they're trying to deal with is that after Labor Day, you're into the fall, and you're pretty close to into the next election cycle.
Yep.
And your window of time that you can use what is, tenuous but real control of the federal government to kind of, do your agenda, it's just gone. So I mean, it is it's worrisome to me. And again, it drives me crazy when I see, people on Twitter and other forums or something going, the Democrats, the Democrats. You know, what are the Democrats thinking? Are the Democrats gonna do this Lucy in the football thing again? Well, as we have just discussed, it's not the Democrats. If you have a beef, it's with Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, and really large. I don't know where she is on. It's hard to say where she is in any of this stuff, since I think a lot of her foot dragging is performative and kind of needless at some level, right? Whereas Manchin's, with Manchin, it's a very different thing. But again, it's them. It's not Chuck Schumer. It's not Joe Biden.
Yeah. She is a
But
part
we
of this.
will,
She's a part of that backup bipartisan
yeah,
group. So,
yeah. I mean, at a certain point, the White House may just need to kind of call that bluff.
yeah.
And I don't know where we are on that, but that is worrisome to me, because what power does, at the end of the day, what power does Joe Biden have over Joe Manchin? Not much. Not much.
Right.
He's going to run a primary against him. I mean, who cares? That's not going to accomplish anything.
Yeah. So let's segue into the other thing that the same suspects are playing a big role in, which is this January 6th commission. Schumer invoked cloture this week, which means it's going to come up for a vote soon. Um, and, the initial kind of momentum or potential that bill had was pretty well stymied when McConnell came out against it, which probably helped dampen some of the House's response, even though, notwithstanding, still 35 Republicans voted for the commission in the House. So now we go over to the Senate, where it's, very clear that it's dead. I mean, right now we only have Romney and Murkowski being positive about the commission without, demanding changes. You have more Collins and Toomey are squishy about it. Maybe if we do this, if we let Republicans.
What is Collins? What is her notional demand?
Yeah, her beef is that she wants basically Republican commissioners to have their own staff. She's worried that the staff appointment language gives the chair of the commission, which will be appointed by Democrats, too much power, even though, as people keep bringing up, it is not only virtually identical to how the staff process went in the 9/11 commission, the much lauded 9/11 commission, but this one even encourages more collaboration. The other one was just like the chairman will, staff it up, and then this new one is the chairman with input from the vice chairman will staff it. So, and people
Right.
don't like her idea, because then then you're going to have warring staffs on top of warring
Like kind of two
commissioners.
different like almost like two different commissions.
Right.
I guess that's the point,
Yeah.
that they want it to be, so Republicans can, in essence, really have their own commission. You have your own staff, you have your own commissioners. You each do your own things, and you're just, it's kind of like a congressional committee. I mean, it does seem pretty clearly just like looking for reasons to, oh, I support it in general. I just need this little change that obviously I know will, um, upset the whole apple cart and mean, it's so we know basically what's going on there. And just before we started recording, there's this story where the mother of Brian Sicknick, the officer who died right after, you know uh, getting in a confrontation with these insurrectionists. And I guess now, you know, after it was determined that they could not, you know, he died of stroke, seemingly healthy guy, died of a series of strokes, you know, within, or, you know, kind of had the strokes within several hours of the confrontation, but they could not, it seems pretty clear they're connected at some level, but they could not find specifically how. And once that was there, that gave sort of license for Republicans to say that didn't really, you know, that didn't really have anything to do with anything. Yeah, he died, but he didn't die because of anything the insurrectionists did, and ergo, we who gave, you know, aid and comfort to the insurrection, that's not, you know, that's not our problem. But now his mother is basically asking for meetings with all of the, I don't know if it's all the Republican senators or all the Republican senators who, you know, conceivably, you know, might be people who would support the commission, and wants to talk with them. Now that obviously creates a pretty uncomfortable dynamic, I would think, for a lot of them, because I think her presence, I think, sort of short circuits the Republican desire to say that his death just is tragic, but has nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the insurrection. It's just sort of like just someone who died. And clearly, it would seem that that is not the mother's perspective. So, do we have any more sense of what's going on with this new development?
I mean, my kind of initial reaction is just they're gonna dodge her the way they dodged, Michael Fanone, who's the other officer
Yeah,
who's been specifically seeking a meeting with Kevin McCarthy, who has just ignored him, totally ignored
right,
him. And we've kind of
right,
seen
right.
little blips like this throughout the process. The other kind of big one was this letter comes out on a Capitol Police letterhead
Yeah,
of very raw emotional outrage at the Republican dismissiveness for the need for the commission and what that implicitly says about their feelings towards the officers who were there, those who died, those who were injured, those who were still kind of grappling with how terrible the day was. um, and it got a
does,
ton of attention.
does that Fanon, that one officer, is he still on the force, or is he like on the force but maybe not actively on the force because he's still recovering from his injuries? What is his status?
He's
Is he
still on the
still part of the
force
Capitol? Okay,
to my knowledge.
okay, okay,
um
okay.
yeah, he had a heart attack and a concussion during the insurrection, so he's kind of
Right,
become the mouthpiece for what is clearly still considerable anger among the force, even though that letter ended up not being officially sanctioned or from the force in its whole. It was basically just some officers who got their hands on letterhead, is what it seems.
right, 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 right.
But yeah, I mean, I just, as almost incredible as it is to suggest that a lawmaker would just kind of blow off the mother of an officer who died protecting them, even
Mm-hmm.
who died in, even if you want to be so semantic about it, who died in the days after the insurrection. But to her, she sees those as connected, and she sees what he did as basically dying to protect them, to just like blow her off. I mean,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
also, that kind of shows though the what Congress looks like now versus what it looked like before, because pretty much the one guaranteed thing you could count on is that Republican lawmakers were going to go out of their way to show, you know, ultimate deference and respect to the law enforcement entities, the military police. That's always what, that was their bread and butter, like we're the
Mm-hmm.
patriotic party. Everything we do is kind of in respect of these people. But now that's
You know,
become
well,
trickier political
it
calculus.
it's also, that has also been, that has long been a thing, except when it's not a thing. If you go back to the 90s, one of the big things was on the right was vilifying federal law enforcement, ATF, you know, FBI, ATF. There was this notorious NRA uh, ad campaign about jackbooted thugs, federal law enforcement, and that gets into the stuff out west and all these, these things. But Republicans have, certainly the right of the Republican Party has, and like, NRA types and stuff like that, have a long history with being totally able to be totally pro law enforcement, except law enforcement that, you know, crosses their, does things or says things or supports things that is in conflict with them. So they're they've got experience with that.
Right.
They know how to handle that.
Right. And then the other piece just of this situation, a little bit different from the Sitnik angle, but, you know, Manchin was specifically asked if Republicans do filibuster the commission bill, which it seems likely is going to be their first,
Yeah.
successful filibuster of this term. Are you going to do anything about it? Is that going to push you to change the filibuster rules? And he said, no, 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 no. I'm still insisting on maintaining the 60 vote threshold. That would be, that would be terrible, but I'm not actually going to
But
do anything
didn't
about it.
he and Cinema put out this statement
Mm-hmm.
that I think kind of the essence of the situation. They put the two of them put out this statement to their Republican colleagues, basically begging them, please support this, please, 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 and also please support this, and which I think they do want them to support this, but it does throw into very stark relief that absent absent their support for the filibuster, this would not be an issue. It is entirely at their sufferance, the two of their sufferance. Now there's a little bit more, we've talked about before, there are other Senate Democrats who probably really don't want to kind of bite that bullet, but the fact that they are not willing to kind of put their name on it, I think tells you that they'd fold if it was going to happen. So there we are, and I'm still curious if there is going to be some point where Senate Democrats, in some more direct way and more public way, basically said to Joe Manchin, kind of like, dude, here's your who you blaming now? Because there's sort of implicit in everything that Joe Manchin says is this idea that there's not bipartisanship because we're not trying hard enough. We Democrats aren't trying hard enough. You Republicans aren't trying hard enough. As Americans, we're not trying hard enough. Blah 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 blah. But what the White House, what Joe Biden, what Chuck Schumer is doing is kind of like, okay, show us how it's done, dude. You lead the way. You lead the way, and you find the bipartisan compromises. And it's all, it's funny. We know why they're not doing it, but it's interesting to hypothesize an alternative universe where Republicans say, okay, let's get some compromises so we can, kind of throw the Democrats a little off balance, that we can say, that Joe Manchin can say, hey, I got the bipartisan compromise on the January 6th commission, or I got the bipartisan compromise on the hard infrastructure plan, and the fact that he was able to get the compromise there means that the that the caring economy infrastructure plan goes down because all that. But no, it's just no to everything, and that leaves Joe Manchin just sort of there, kind of without an argument.
Yeah.
But not clear he needs an argument because you know he holds the cards.
Right. Okay, let's move on to the kind of militia state violence. somewhat quickly, and then we can get into our questions. We are, as
Yeah, well, so
usual, running out of road. Too much to talk about.
yeah, well, I think maybe the main thing is, if you've seen these posts I've been doing, you've got this like militia recall up in Shasta County, California. You've got this situation where there's like a Proud Boys faction in the Republican Party of Nevada trying to take over the GOP, and there's really been a large number of cases over the last 6 or 7 months of public officials just in this state and that state just resigning because they're afraid they're going to get killed by kind of anti-mask
Hmm.
activists. And I think one example of this that I wrote about a couple days ago is this guy who was I don't remember the exact. He was the secretary of some department in the New Mexico government, Democratic administration. I don't remember exactly what department, but it was a department that had contact with COVID stuff. Not so much the healthcare side of it, but masking and, you know, lockdowns or something like this. And he resigned, I don't know, a couple weeks ago or something like that. And there was a lot of questions like, why did he resign? Was he fired? What happened? And then a few days ago, he came forward. He's like, I resigned because I was getting so many death threats and threats to my family that I just didn't feel safe anymore. And not only did he resign, he's moving out of the state, right? He's leaving the state. And like, I'm laughing, kind of, dark humor, but I mean, that kind of tells you the story. So I think since we're running a little low on time, I'll just say keep an eye out in your area. What are you seeing in your area that might be like this? And if you see stuff, and especially if it's not really getting attention nationwide, shoot us an email. Talk at talkingpointsmemo.com, because we're trying to pull together these stories from around the country, because as is often the case with things that develop like this, you've got a lot of things happening just below the national radar. In many cases, it's threatened violence, not actual violence, and not to be brutal about it, but to get a news story, you need someone actually to get killed, right? Not just someone leaving, kind of phone calls or something like that and threatening. So, in any case, if you see examples, drop us a line,
Yeah,
because we're really trying to kind of pull this together and tell this
I would
story.
say on this note, I've been reporting out a story that we'll probably have up later today about a county level official in Orange County, California, who has become the subject of these kind of threats, who's got protesters coming to her house. That happened to a health official on the county level a few weeks ago, and a year ago made one county health official kind of become the first to really quit because of the kind of outpouring of vitriol over her mask mandate, and she was getting death threats and everything. And the only reason that we came across that story is because a reader flagged it, sent it in to us. So we really appreciate those tips, and they do kind of help us bring this lower level stuff to a bigger audience.
And one thing for people to understand is that, historically, Orange County, California, very conservative,
Hmm.
kind of the base of the conservative movement in California. But that's no longer the case. It is not. It's not democratic quite yet. I mean, I think that in 2018, all of the I believe all of the House seats in Orange County went to Democrats. I think that Republicans clawed back maybe one or two of those in 2020. But the point is, it has become much bluer. It is basically Democratic, although not 100%. I think Biden, won pretty handily there. So in a lot of these cases, it's not like we're talking about things happening like in Idaho or West Virginia, often it's cases where a political jurisdiction bestrides a blue urban suburban area and then a kind of a redder rural area, or cases like this where certainly Trump types are very much in the minority in Orange County. Republicans going to win House seats, but they're moderate Republicans, at least by current standards. Um, and so you have just these very uh, impassioned, violence adjacent Republicans menacing public officials. And if you think about it, that makes sense because if you're in the majority, you don't have to threaten people with violence. You just vote them out, right? It's when you're not that you get into doing this kind of stuff. So keep your eyes out and let us know what you see.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to transition to questions. Thank you, everyone who sent them in. We still have a backlog, and we might get to them in future episodes. But our first one is about a totally different story that's kind of broken new ground recently. So this is from Richard, who says, I'm seeing indications on Twitter and elsewhere that the lab leak hypothesis about COVID-19 may be getting viewed more favorably. Frankly, I'm too busy with everyday life right now to look into this. What do your trusted sources say? So, just to give some context to kind of what's changed there, it's the Wall Street Journal is the one who reported that a previously undisclosed intelligence report suggests that 3 researchers who worked in the lab in Wuhan, where they were studying, different strains of the virus and everything like that, 3 of them were sick enough to be hospitalized in fall of 2019, which takes things a step further than what we knew from mid-January, where a State Department report released that researchers from inside the lab had fallen sick in the fall of 2019. Though that report also said their symptoms were consistent both with COVID and with seasonal illness. So there was a little blurriness there, even though that was a step further from what was kind of the Chinese party line, which is that, no one had come into contact with the disease until the very end of December. So we've kind of had shifting knowledge on this ground, but this new tidbit suggests that if researchers within the lab felt ill enough in fall of 2019 to be hospitalized, that's an important kind of link in the chain that we didn't know before.
Yeah, I think, to me, I think it's important to distinguish two different dimensions of this story. One is that and even that I want to emphasize, intelligence
Right.
report. Intelligence reports, you know, sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're disinformation themselves. But there's two dimensions. One is that we do have some of what might be called new evidence that points in this direction. There's really not a lot of it, but let's just kind of categorically describe it. One part of it is things, kind of new information. The other is something different, and that is that we have never known how this originated. Generally speaking, novel diseases jump across lines of species, and that's where they come from. And there is a long, not just long, there's, thousands, millions of year history of this. And the resistance to this theory going back to the very beginning of the COVID epidemic, I think to a great extent was based on there being no evidence for it, and yet people with strong political motivations started making accusations really with no evidence at all, and that created. I mean, if you go back to the very beginning of COVID, you had a number of Republican senators saying, this is probably like a Chinese bioweapon
Right.
intentionally released on the world, or a bioweapon that, was created as a bioweapon and maybe they didn't want to release it then, but they did, and blah 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 blah. Now, there are ways that scientists can fairly easily detect an engineered virus. And from the very beginning, almost all the people who do genomic studies of this have said no, that's just not what this looks like. But that doesn't rule out that you're just doing some experimenting with a naturally occurring virus and it leaks from your lab. Or you're kind of, fiddling with it in an experiment and it leaks from the lab. So I think there is some misunderstanding, and to an extent intentional misunderstanding, about, oh, this, they said it was definitely not true and now everybody's reconsidering. A lot of that is not really so clear cut. I don't know anybody in this field who was saying last year it's impossible that this happened. What they're saying was, we don't have evidence that it happened, so don't run around saying it happened when you have no evidence for it. So there's that, and I think that is the unfocused on part of the story. The other part of it, though, is that there are some hints, like Kate described. The other thing, though, too, is that when something like this jumps, from one species to humans, there's usually a um, there's links in the chain. Well, it went from bats to this intermediate animal, and then that animal was near humans, and it went to humans. And they have not found what that intermediate animal was or how that happened. And without finding that, I mean, if you found that, you could say, okay, we see how it happened. And we don't have any need for this lab leak explanation because we know how it happened. They haven't found that. So you have these things coming together, and the reality is the Chinese government has basically not been forthcoming about anything.
Right.
And that does raise questions, although there's nothing that the Chinese government is forthcoming about. That's their system. They're never forthcoming. They're never transparent about anything. So it's we don't know.
Yeah, I think the primary problem is that the source of COVID, where it came from, has been uncertain from the beginning. We've pretty much never known. And then you had kind of bad actors like Trump or like Tom Cotton conflating the idea of uh, an accidental leak with a purposeful bioweapon. So then you had, I do think like well-meaning media outlets trying to, turn down the temperature and denounce that as a conspiracy theory, but you had this kind of reasonable hypothesis conflated with this like inflammatory accusation, and then they ended up getting debunked as one, even though they're two
Right.
separate entities. And then it's just, on top of that, it's hard because when your messengers are Trump and Mike Pompeo, who are also really infusing these arguments with like, pretty severe and racist anti-Chinese rhetoric, which, as we saw throughout the pandemic has manifested in real, upticks in anti-Asian violence, then it also becomes more difficult to take what they say at face value, because these are people who've shown themselves very comfortable with repeating conspiracy theories and repeating lies. So I think people are being very hard on people who kind of dismiss those arguments outright as conspiracy theories, or as kind of a tool, an anti-Chinese propaganda tool. But these people that we were hearing this from, that's what they always did. So I think there was definitely a mistake in saying those things are definitely not true or debunked out of hand. But I think that was an attempt to check the usual kind of
You know, I,
lying we get from these people.
I'm not even sure that was a mistake. I mean, different people said different things, but if you look, most of these cases, it was even the people who supposedly said it was fake. What they actually said is very unlikely, no evidence for it. And I think I have a slightly different take on this, which is that through 2020, Trump, Pompeo, their political allies started pushing this in tandem to when they were getting more and more criticism for botching the pandemic. So this was their response when people said, "Oh, your response has been a disaster." They said, "It's not me. This was a Chinese attack on us." So you had people with very clear and very dishonest political motives claiming something that they had very little evidence for and still have very little evidence for. And I think that one of the changes is that when you no longer have the president of the United States claiming something like that, that there's no evidence for, there's a little less sense of like, okay, yeah, we should look into this. So that has changed. But again, I want to come back to this point because it gets really it gets lost in a lot of these conversations about disinformation and conspiracy theories and stuff like that. If you were shouting at the top of your lungs, I know this is true, this happened, these people did this thing to us, and you have no evidence for it at all, you have no evidence for it, that is not a hypothesis that may conceivably be true. You're lying because you have no evidence for it. So I think it's important that we remember, yeah, it's possible it's true, but when you're claiming you know it's true, when you're claiming you have evidence for it and you don't, that's lying. So if it ends up that, 10 years from now in some different political environment, the Chinese government says, "Hey, we found out we did this. It leaked out of our lab. Our bad." That won't mean that Trump was telling the truth. It mean that the thing he lied about for his own political motives turned out to be true, kind of by accident. And I really think it's important to remember this because again, if you claim things, lots of things could be true. If you claim you know they're true and claim you have evidence when you don't, that's lying. That's not maybe telling the truth, subject to to there being evidence at some future point. Anyway, that's my soapbox. Made my point.
Yeah. So either way, it seems pretty unlikely we're going to know for sure in any solid way because, like you mentioned, the Chinese government has been very uncooperative with, they won't reveal like the data, the safety labs, the lab records from the lab itself, which could help triangulate if it did come from within the lab. They did partner with the World Health Organization to kind of do an investigation, but with very strict parameters, very strict control. And even as the World Health Organization released it, they said they want more openness and cooperation from the Chinese
Yeah.
government. Um,
It's also the case that it is entirely possible that they themselves don't know.
yeah.
It's not. I mean, it is sort of. It is. Let's take one hypothetical that research scientist is just kind of uncareful. Makes a mistake and gets infected, and then doesn't know it, and then spreads it outside the lab. Through normal just breathing and stuff like that. That can happen. Now, it should be the case that, if that is the case, it should be the case that they have lab samples there that look a lot like COVID, right? In their samples and stuff like that. But again, I think it is good to know that it is quite possible that this did happen, and the Chinese themselves aren't sure whether it happened or not, and they probably don't want to know because it's obviously really bad if this was due to their negligence. So there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
And for everything I have said, it is absolutely true that Chinese government has been totally not forthcoming about this. There is no doubt about that at all. And that has been something that all of the relevant entities have been saying since the beginning. You know, unlikely, but it sure would be helpful if the Chinese government would be open and let people, you know, investigate what happened.
Yeah. So I don't know. Should we just leave it there for today? We've gone pretty long. We can address the next question next episode.
Well, let's try to run through
Okay.
the next question. We'll try
So
to
the other question,
I'll
again,
try to talk
something
a little less.
completely different. Why do you think this is from Zach? Why do you think the Justice Department is dragging its feet with releasing various memos associated with the Mueller report? I would have thought this is a no-brainer and shine some much-needed light on what looks to be an entirely corrupt process. So the context here is that this watchdog organization sued a while ago to try to get their hands on some documents that kind of were in the universe of uh, the Mueller report, Barr's response to the Mueller report, and Barr's decision not to pursue criminal charges against Trump. That's kind of now narrowed down to a couple specific documents, but the one that we're talking about is a memo from the Office of Legal Counsel, which Barr says he used to come to his decision to not pursue criminal charges against Trump. But then there's a federal judge in DC, Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who this week absolutely excoriated the Justice Department because she read that memo over DOJ objections and basically said this memo, which Barr kind of presented as this like neutral document that helped him reach his decision, was crafted as part of Barr's attempt to deal with the Mueller report and to, kind of make a PR campaign around it that helps him say, no, we're not going to pursue charges. Mueller didn't find enough and didn't get enough. But now, so she ordered the full release of it, the whole memo, and the Biden DOJ is fighting that decision, appealing her decision. They released a part of the memo, but not really enough to get into all the meat of it, and are saying, basically are taking the stance that the DOJ should kind of has privilege, deliberative process privilege, it's called here. They don't have to release these documents. Their internal deliberation should be allowed to be private. So now we're in this kind of weird position where they're defending the privacy of basically the Trump DOJ, but as a side effect, might be helping shroud some deep corruption in the decision not to prosecute Trump.
Yeah, I think, this question, it's a good question, but I think it's one that we can dispatch relatively easily. And that's what Kate just said, that you are always going to have institutional prerogatives that the incumbents, whether, incumbent president, incumbent attorney general, are going to be very solicitous of, even if it is getting in the way of revealing information of bad acts or of former attorneys general, former presidents who the current folks don't like and think we're doing bad things. So I don't think I think the one thing we can be clear about this is there's really no need to, this may be a good or bad decision, but there's no need to think that there's something fishy going on. Like, why would the Biden DOJ be covering for Trump? Their institutional prerogatives, the DOJ in general, under anybody's management, wants to be protective of its future rights to say, hey, our decision making is our decision making. You can't, we don't have to tell you the innards of how we make decisions. So in that sense, I think it's pretty clear cut. There's obviously potentially a lot of reasons that the current crew should lean in the other direction. And there are different ways they can potentially do that. They don't want to be forced by a federal judge. But I don't think there's any question. That's the reason why.
Right.
There are institutional prerogatives that go beyond the specifics of Bill Barr or Mueller or any of those other folks who are doing stuff the last 4 or 5 years.
I do think it sucks, just unrelated to whatever kind of institutional reason they have. And, every administration doesn't want any strictures put upon the power of, the executive branch in any way. But I think the argument that there's quite a lot of public interest in what exactly happened here is high. And, the risk, also the chance that putting more information out like this memo could return scrutiny to this case, now that, Trump is not in office anymore. So at least the one kind of Mueller's, dedication to the old OLC precedent that you can't prosecute a sitting president doesn't apply as much anymore. But, this was just a case where Barr just, acted like Trump's personal attorney. He went out of his way to undermine Mueller, to spin his findings, and to feed the public just, something that was not true. And because of that, I think a lot of Mueller's report has been spun in
Yeah, never
people's
really kind of fully
brain.
appreciate.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
never
no, I
hit
think
all the way.
yeah, I think that's right, and I think that, and one thing, and this is something that I'd be curious to you, sort of, executive branch lawyer types, think of this, that it's one thing to say we don't want to be compelled by a federal judge. That's a certain kind of thing. But there are other contexts when you can, when a when the federal government can on its own, voluntarily, not under any kind of compulsion, for different rationales, publicize information. And so I don't know, I've been pushing for months or years now of having kind of like basically a commission, right? Something like kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission to kind of to unwind all this Trump era stuff. Um, I'm curious whether there are ways for the administration to do things like that without setting precedents that come via a compulsory judicial process. Maybe we need to finish up now, but maybe if you're listening, if you're if you're the kind of lawyer that deals with executive branch jurisprudence and this isn't FOIA, but FOIA and all these kind of things, let us know. Let us know if there's if there is a way to kind of clean house without creating the kinds of precedents that any current management of the executive branch is going to resist. Let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee, New Orleans style cold brew iced coffee. Great stuff. If you're ready to give it a try, you can get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay,
Remember, reach
we
us with
got through all of it.
questions and comments at
Yes.
talk@talkingpointsmemo.com.
Yeah, questions have been great, so keep them
Really
coming.
great. Okay.
All
See
right,
you next
later.
week.